The stench of antiseptic clung to the air inside the field hospital, blending with smoke from the smoldering ruins outside Berlin. Bombs had fallen through the night, shaking the ground and the hearts of those who still clung to hope. Helene Krauss pressed a blood-soaked bandage against a soldier's chest, her hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. His breathing was shallow, his eyes clouded. "Hold on, Friedrich," she whispered. "You're almost through." But she knew he wouldn't make it through the hour. Outside, the rhythmic hum of approaching aircraft made her spine tighten. Another raid, another night of chaos. The nurses exchanged weary glances, their white uniforms now grey with soot. For Helene, war had become a pattern of repetition, pain, loss, and fleeting mercy. She moved from cot to cot with mechanical precision, but her eyes betrayed the ache beneath. Somewhere between duty and despair, she began to wonder what purpose remained in saving men, only to send them back to the front. If you love stories that reveal the humanity hidden in history, subscribe now for more true wartime tales, stories that remind us that compassion can survive even in the darkest hours. When the bombings finally ceased, dawn crept through shattered windows, lighting the faces of the few still alive. Helene stepped outside, her boots crunching over debris. The cold morning smelled of wet ash and iron. She raised her eyes toward the grey horizon, where smoke mingled with fog. That's when the trucks arrived, a convoy bearing the Red Cross insignia of surrender. Word spread quickly. The front had collapsed in France, and medical personnel were being relocated. "Where will they take us?" asked Lotta, a young nurse whose face was streaked with grime. Helene adjusted her cap, her voice calm but hollow. "Somewhere safer, I hope." But deep inside, she sensed it was the end of something larger than the war itself, the end of the world she'd known. Hours later, orders came. Helene and several others were to accompany wounded soldiers to a temporary Allied facility in France. There they would surrender their medical posts under the Geneva terms. The journey was silent. Fields once golden with harvest now lay scorched, and villages were nothing more than rubble and ghosts. Helene stared through the truck's canvas flap, wondering whether mercy still had meaning when spoken by either side. Upon reaching the Allied perimeter, the scene defied her expectations. American medics worked shoulder to shoulder with captured German nurses, their gestures efficient, almost respectful. No shouting, no cruelty, just quiet professionalism. A tall man in a khaki uniform approached her. His insignia marked him as a captain. "You're Nurse Krauss?" he asked, his English measured but clear. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I am here to help with the wounded." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Good. We can use every steady hand we have." Helene blinked, unsure if she'd heard kindness in his tone or pity. Whatever it was, it unsettled her. The enemy she had imagined, ruthless, cold, unfeeling, did not stand before her. Instead, she saw a man who looked tired of war, just like her. That night, as she bandaged an American soldier's arm, she overheard him murmur, "Thank you, ma'am." It wasn't mockery. It was gratitude. And for the first time in years, Helene felt something other than fear. Confusion. Could the enemy truly be this human? She didn't know yet that this question would follow her across the ocean, shaping the rest of her life. The rain had not stopped for days. It drummed softly against the canvas of the tent as Helene wrapped another soldier's arm, her fingers numb from cold and fatigue. Outside, Allied trucks rolled through the mud, engines humming like distant thunder. The war, it seemed, had moved on, yet she and the others remained caught in its fading shadow. The German outpost had surrendered, and though the fighting had ceased, the silence that followed was heavier than the sound of bombs. Helene felt a strange calm settle over her as she looked around the temporary camp in France. The wounded lay side by side, German and American, separated only by thin lines of protocol. She had never imagined tending to a man wearing an Allied uniform, yet here she was, cleaning the dirt from an American soldier's wound while his partner watched her with guarded curiosity. "You're gentle," the soldier said through a faint smile. "Not what I expected." Helene didn't answer. She focused on tightening the bandage, then whispered, "Pain doesn't choose sides. Her English was halting, but the meaning was clear. The man nodded, his expression softening. It was in that moment Helene realized how disarming compassion could be, a language that reached where orders and propaganda could not. Captain Richard Evans entered the tent soon after, clipboard tucked under his arm. He was the same officer who had spoken to her upon arrival, his posture firm yet unthreatening. "Nurse Kraus," he said, glancing at her patient's arm, "you've done fine work. I'd like you to assist our medics with the German prisoners until transport is ready." She straightened, unsure whether to thank him or question the order. "Yes, Captain," she finally replied. Outside, she found the other captured nurses gathering near a stack of crates, their expressions wary. Lotta, her closest companion, leaned closer and whispered in German, "Do you think they'll treat us like prisoners?" Helene's gaze lingered on the American guards nearby, young, polite, almost indifferent. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But they haven't treated us like enemies." That night, as the rain eased into mist, Helene sat beneath a canvas awning, writing in her small notebook. The ink bled slightly from the damp air. "If kindness exists on both sides, then why does the war still go on?" she wrote. "And if they are our enemies, why do they look at us without hate?" A faint voice interrupted her thoughts. "You write often," Captain Evans said, standing a few feet away. His boots left shallow prints in the mud. "It helps me remember who I am," she answered without looking up. He hesitated, then nodded. "That's something most of us are trying to do." For a brief moment neither spoke. The camp lights flickered in the drizzle and the smell of wet earth carried the weight of the war's aftermath. Helene felt something unfamiliar stir inside her, a quiet sense of safety. By dawn the orders came. The captured medical staff would be transported across the Atlantic for reassignment. Rumors spread among the nurses like smoke. Some wept, others clung to hope. Lotta grasped Helene's hand, her voice trembling. "America. Do you think it's better there?" Helene looked at the grey sky, uncertain. "I think it will be different," she said softly. As the engines roared to life, Helene turned for one last glance at the muddy French camp. The war had taken everything familiar, yet something deep within told her the next chapter would challenge what she believed about mercy, loyalty, and the meaning of being human. The smell of salt water clung to the steel corridors of the transport ship, mingling with the faint scent of oil and damp wool. Helene stood near the railing, her coat buttoned high against the wind. The vast Atlantic stretched before her, grey, endless, and indifferent. Behind her, voices rose and fell in nervous chatter. German nurses speaking softly, American guards pacing with quiet vigilance. No one seemed entirely sure what awaited them on the other side. For the first time in years, Helene was far from the noise of guns, yet she felt no peace. The ocean's silence only magnified her thoughts. She thought of her brother, Wilhelm, fighting somewhere in the east, of their mother's hands kneading bread in a kitchen that might no longer exist. She tried to picture home, but the image dissolved into smoke. Lotta approached, her face pale beneath her scarf. "Do you think they'll keep us as prisoners?" she asked, clutching the railing. "I don't know," Helene replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. "But they could have treated us worse already. That must mean something." Lotta gave a faint, uncertain smile. "You sound almost hopeful." "Maybe I'm just tired of being afraid." Below deck, the hum of the engines was constant, like a heartbeat beneath the floor. The ship's infirmary had been converted into a makeshift ward for wounded soldiers from both sides. Helene volunteered to help, her hands instinctively finding purpose in work. The American medics observed her cautiously at first, whispering among themselves. But when a young seaman suffered a seizure from fever, Helene moved without hesitation, clearing his airway, steadying his head, her voice calm and steady. Afterward, one of the medics, a freckled man named Tom, nodded to her. "Didn't think I'd ever see a German saving one of ours," he said. Helene wiped her hands on a rag. "Pain doesn't ask for a passport," she replied softly. From that moment, the mood aboard shifted. The nurses and medics began sharing coffee during long shifts, exchanging halting English and broken German. Laughter occasionally pierced the gloom, rare, brief, but genuine. Still, some glances lingered with suspicion, reminders that peace was not yet official. At night, the waves grew restless. The ship rocked violently under dark skies, and whispers of U-boats haunted the corridors. Each creak of metal made Helene's heart race. She would lie awake, staring at the dim ceiling, wondering if death would find her not on the battlefield, but in the depths of the sea. One night Captain Evans came to check on the infirmary. He found her seated beside a sleeping patient, writing in her notebook by the dim lantern light. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly. Helene looked up, startled. "I find it difficult when the ocean sounds like it's breathing." He smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it. The sea's like war, unpredictable, but it keeps you honest." She studied him for a moment, unsure what he meant. "And when the war ends?" she asked. He paused, his eyes on the dark water outside. "Then we see what's left of honesty." The ship continued its slow voyage westward, carrying with it fear, uncertainty, and the faintest spark of something Helene couldn't yet name. As dawn broke on the 10th day, the clouds thinned, revealing a horizon lined with pale light. She inhaled the cold morning air, her heart torn between dread and wonder. Somewhere beyond that horizon waited America, the land she had been told was her enemy, and the place where she would soon discover what mercy truly meant. The first glimpse of America came through a veil of fog. The ship's horn sounded across the harbor as the coastline of New Jersey emerged like a dream half-remembered. Pale buildings, cranes rising above the docks, and the faint hum of life, untouched by war. Helene gripped the railing tightly. The nurses around her whispered in disbelief. They had expected a land of hostility, guarded faces, and harsh orders. Instead, they saw civilians waving from the pier, not cheering but not cursing either, just watching, curious. When the ship docked, the scent of salt gave way to the aroma of roasted coffee drifting from the port town. Helene's boots met American soil for the first time. A strange calm filled her chest. Not triumph, not relief, but the quiet shock of realizing she was still alive. Soldiers lined them up, their expressions businesslike yet free of menace. One man handed her a small paper cup of water. "Welcome to America, miss," he said politely. For a moment, Helene thought she had misheard him. Lotta, beside her, murmured, "Did he just say welcome?" Helene nodded faintly. "I think he did." They were escorted through customs, their documents stamped with a red medical personnel seal. No cages, no insults, just efficiency. The American spoke in clipped tones but offered smiles that seemed genuine. For women who had braced for contempt, kindness was almost unbearable. As the group boarded a military bus, Helene watched through the window. Children played near the docks, their laughter carried by the wind. A woman in a blue dress pushed a stroller down the street. The sight of such ordinary peace ached in her chest. "They live as if the world never burned," she whispered. Captain Evans boarded last, scanning a list before sitting near the front. "You'll be stationed temporarily at Camp Pine Grove," he announced. "You'll find it different from what you're used to." His voice was even, but something in his tone hinted at reassurance. Hours passed as the bus rolled through small towns. Wooden houses stood in neat rows, porches adorned with flags, mailboxes gleaming in the sun. Some people waved as the convoy passed, others simply stared. To Helene, even the air felt lighter, as if the grief of Europe hadn't crossed the ocean. Lotta leaned closer. "They don't hate us," she whispered, astonished. Helene gave a small smile. "Maybe they don't know how." When they stopped for inspection, Helene stepped down, her eyes catching the glint of a nurse's uniform nearby, crisp white, marked with the American Red Cross. The woman wearing it, tall and auburn-haired, noticed her staring and approached with an easy smile. "You must be the German staff they told us about," she said. "I'm Margaret Lewis." Helene hesitated before replying, "Helene Kraus." Margaret extended her hand without hesitation. "Well, Helene, welcome to a country where we patch up anyone who's bleeding." "You'll fit right in." Helene took her hand. It was warm, steady. That small gesture unraveled weeks of fear. As the bus continued north, she watched Margaret wave them off, her figure fading in the distance. Something about that woman, confident, kind, unguarded, left an impression Helene couldn't explain. That night, as the nurses settled into the temporary quarters near the base, Helene lay awake, listening to the hum of crickets outside. For the first time in years, there were no explosions, no cries, no orders shouted through chaos, only the soft pulse of a country untouched by ruin. And yet, as her eyes drifted shut, a single question pulsed in her mind. If this is the enemy, why does it feel like peace? The road to Camp Pine Grove wound through dense pine forests that stretched endlessly beneath a pale morning sky. The air smelled of resin and rain-soaked earth. When the buses stopped, Helene stepped out and gazed at the orderly rows of white buildings beyond the gate. A sign read, Camp Pine Grove Military Hospital. It looked nothing like the grim barracks she had imagined. Instead of fences lined with barbed wire, there were gardens, gravel paths, and the faint sound of music drifting from a radio somewhere inside. A sergeant guided them through the entrance, clipboard in hand. "You'll be assisting our staff with the German prisoners recovering here," he said. "The hospital operates under Red Cross supervision, so everyone's expected to work together." His tone was firm but not unfriendly. Inside the main ward, Helene froze. The sight before her challenged everything she knew of captivity. The patients were German soldiers, many still in uniform, their beds clean, sheets white, wounds dressed with precision. American nurses moved efficiently between them, checking temperatures and changing bandages. Some spoke softly to the patients, offering water, even smiles. It was discipline, not cruelty, that ruled here. Lotta whispered beside her, "It's civilized." Helene nodded slowly. "More than I expected." Margaret Lewis appeared from behind a curtain, her auburn hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. "Welcome to Pine Grove," she said warmly. "You'll find we run things by compassion, not nationality." She handed Helene a folded uniform, the same white dress worn by the American staff. "You're one of us now, at least while you're here." Helene accepted it hesitantly. The fabric felt impossibly soft, almost symbolic. "Thank you," she murmured. Margaret smiled. "We heal people, Helene." Politics can wait outside. By afternoon, Helene was tending to a German prisoner named Otto, whose leg had been shattered in France. He looked up, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Why are you wearing that uniform?" he asked in German. "Because I'm a nurse," she replied, "and because they allow me to help. They'll use you," he spat weakly. "You'll see." Helene adjusted his bandage without responding. In truth, part of her feared he might be right. Later, while washing instruments at the basin, she overheard two American medics talking nearby. "Can you believe they let Krauts work here?" one muttered. The other shrugged. "That German nurse fixed Peterson's shoulder better than anyone else. Guess decency's not on one side only." The words stayed with her. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed. The world inside Pine Grove existed in contradiction, a place where enemies shared coffee, where uniforms mattered less than the wounds underneath them. As dusk settled, Helene walked past the rows of beds, her footsteps echoing softly. Some prisoners muttered prayers, others slept with uneasy dreams. She paused near the last bed, where an American soldier lay unconscious, his face pale. The tag around his wrist bore a familiar handwriting, Captain Evans's signature. Instinct guided her hand as she adjusted his IV line. "You save them and they save you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she meant. When she stepped outside, the pine trees rustled in the cool wind, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed, a reminder that war still raged beyond this fragile peace. Helene tilted her face toward the fading light and felt something shift inside her. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. Nights at Camp Pine Grove were quiet in a way Helene had never known before. The hum of insects outside the barracks replaced the thunder of artillery. In that silence, memories crept back like ghosts she couldn't banish. She sat by a small wooden desk, the faint glow of a lamp casting soft light over a stack of yellowed paper. Each sheet bore the same greeting. Dear Wilhelm, the name of her younger brother who had vanished on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. She wrote to him as if he were still alive, her pen moving with calm precision. "The Americans treat us with civility," she wrote. "They look at us, not through us. Sometimes I forget that I am supposed to be the enemy." Her handwriting trembled slightly. She paused, staring at the words until they blurred. Margaret knocked softly on the doorframe. "You're writing again," she said with a gentle smile. Helene folded the paper instinctively. "It helps me think." "About home?" "Yes, about everything that no longer exists." Margaret entered, holding 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Helene and leaned against the desk. "When my brother was stationed in Italy, I used to write to him every week," she said. "Half the letters never reached him, but I kept writing anyway. Sometimes we write just to keep hope alive." Helene looked down, the warmth of the cup seeping into her hands. "My brother believed Germany was fighting for its honor," she said softly. "Now I wonder if honor survives when mercy dies." Margaret's gaze softened. "Maybe honor isn't what we fight for, but how we treat people when we've already lost." The words lingered in the quiet room. Helene felt something loosen inside her, a small knot of guilt and duty she had carried too long. She unfolded the letter again and began writing, slower this time. "I am learning that compassion can exist even among those we were told to hate." Outside, the camp slept. The nurses' quarters smelled faintly of soap and pine. In the distance, the faint murmur of a harmonica drifted from the soldiers' barracks, a melancholy tune that made Helene's chest tighten with longing. The next morning she visited the infirmary early. The sunrise painted gold across the rows of beds. Otto, the German prisoner with the shattered leg, greeted her with a gruff nod. "You're up before the Americans," he said. "I prefer quiet mornings," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "You sound different these days, softer." Helene smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm learning their ways." He snorted. "Don't forget who you are." She adjusted his blanket. "I haven't. But perhaps remembering who we are isn't as important as remembering who we could be." Later that week, she walked to the edge of the camp, where the fence met the woods. She carried the stack of letters tied neatly with a ribbon. One by one, she read fragments aloud, small confessions of fear, gratitude, and guilt. Then she tucked them back into the ribbon and placed them in a tin box beneath the roots of an old pine tree. "For you, Wilhelm," she whispered, "wherever you are." As she turned to leave, the morning breeze caught her hair, carrying the scent of pine and paper through the air. For the first time in years, she felt light. The letters would never reach their destination, but perhaps they had already fulfilled their purpose, to remind her that words, like mercy, could cross any border. Autumn crept quietly into Camp Pine Grove, painting the pine needles gold and rust. The air had turned crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant fires. For Helene, the days had settled into a rhythm. Morning rounds, quiet meals with the nurses, long evenings spent writing or reading medical journals Margaret lent her. She had grown used to the routine, perhaps even grateful for it. Yet something inside her still refused to rest, a faint ache that no amount of work could ease. One afternoon, as she finished changing a bandage, Captain Evans appeared in the doorway. "Nurse Krauss," he said, his voice formal but not cold. "You're invited to a small dinner tomorrow, Thanksgiving. The officers and medical staff will be attending, you and Nurse Lewis included." Helene looked up in surprise. "A dinner? It's tradition," he replied. "Even in wartime, people need to remember what peace feels like." She hesitated. "You want us there, Germans?" Evans's mouth curved slightly. "You're nurses, Helene. That's all that matters tomorrow night." The next evening, the dining hall was warm and bright. Long tables had been arranged with simple care, linen cloths, candles flickering, trays of roasted turkey and vegetables. The smell alone made Helene's stomach tighten with unexpected hunger. She hadn't seen such abundance since before the war. Margaret greeted her with a grin. "You see, we Americans do know how to celebrate." Helene glanced around nervously. The room buzzed with conversation, English mixed with hesitant German. Some soldiers stared at her group with curiosity, others with faint distrust. But the mood softened as wine was poured and laughter filled the gaps between languages. Evans raised his glass. "To survival," he said, "and to the people who make mercy possible." The toast was simple, sincere. Helene caught his gaze briefly, her chest tightening. She lowered her glass before anyone noticed. Margaret leaned closer, her voice low. "He's not what you expected, is he?" Helene smiled faintly. "No. He listens more than he speaks." "Then he's rare among men in uniform." Dinner unfolded gently. Lotta told stories about childhood winters in Bavaria, and the Americans listened with polite curiosity. Someone played a slow tune on a violin, filling the room with nostalgia. For a fleeting hour, it felt as though the war had been suspended outside the camp gates. When the plates were cleared, Evans approached Helene again. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "The reports from the infirmary mention your patients recover faster under your care." Helene looked down, unsure how to respond. "I just do what any nurse should." He shook his head. "You do more than that. You remind people that kindness doesn't wear a uniform." The word struck her like a soft blow. For years she had buried her emotions beneath duty. Now, faced with an enemy speaking gratitude, she felt disarmed. "You shouldn't say such things," she murmured. "It confuses the line between us." "Maybe that line was never real," he said. Outside, snow began to fall, silent and fine as dust. When the dinner ended, Helene lingered by the doorway, watching the flakes settle on the pine branches. Evans passed by, his footsteps crunching softly. "You'll find America strange," he said. "But maybe strangeness is how peace begins." She didn't answer. Instead, she watched the snow gathering on the earth, white, cold, pure, and wondered whether hearts could ever be cleansed the same way. Winter deepened over Camp Pine Grove, turning the pines into pillars of frost. The hospital ran quietly, its rhythm steady, its air filled with the scent of antiseptic and coffee. For a time, peace felt almost possible, until whispers began to spread. At first, they were nothing but stray murmurs among the orderlies, missing reports, misplaced medical records, a supply list gone from the captain's desk. But by the end of the week, the word espionage was spoken in hushed voices. Helene sensed the change before anyone told her. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Soldiers avoided her gaze. Even the air seemed heavier. Lotta noticed it too. "They're looking at us differently," she whispered as they folded sheets together. "Something's wrong." Helene nodded, her pulse quickening. "It's only rumors. They'll see reason soon enough." But reason, she would learn, was fragile in times of fear. Captain Evans called a meeting that afternoon. The staff gathered in the administrative wing, the tension sharp enough to taste. He spoke with the controlled calm of a man walking through fire. "Confidential files concerning German prisoner transfers have gone missing," he announced. "Until we find out who's responsible, extra security measures will be enforced." A voice from the back interrupted. "You think one of them took it?" The word "them" hung like poison in the air. All eyes shifted toward the German nurses. Helene felt the weight of those stares press into her chest. Evans's expression hardened. "No accusations without proof," he said. "That's an order." But suspicion had already taken root. Later that night, Margaret found Helene sitting alone in the laundry room, her hands trembling over a stack of uniforms. "They think it's one of us," Helene said quietly. "Don't they?" Margaret sighed. "They think it's you." Helene looked up, stunned. "Me?" "Your English is better than the others. You have access to both wards. Someone probably saw you near the offices." Helene's throat tightened. "I would never—" "I know," Margaret interrupted gently. "But fear makes fools of good men. You have to stay calm." The next morning, the camp's mood shifted from unease to open doubt. An American medic who once shared jokes with Helene refused her help. Another nurse whispered as she passed, her voice dripping with contempt. Only Margaret stood by her side, her loyalty quiet but fierce. By midday, Evans summoned her to his office. He didn't meet her eyes at first. "Nurse Krauss, I need you to answer a few questions." His tone was steady yet distant. "Do you believe I'm guilty, Captain?" she asked. "I believe in facts," he said, "and the facts are unclear." "That's not an answer," he exhaled slowly. No, it isn't. He questioned her for nearly an hour, her routines, her duties, every room she'd entered that week. She answered with precision, her voice calm though her hands trembled. When it was over, he said quietly, "You'll remain on duty, but under observation. I'll handle the rest." That night, as Helene returned to the barracks, snow began to fall again. She sat on her bunk, staring at her folded hands. The warmth she had begun to feel in this place had vanished, replaced by a cold she couldn't escape. Even mercy, she realized, could be fragile, easily cracked by fear, by rumor, by the unspoken question that now haunted every glance around her. The wind howled through the pine trees as Helene walked to the administration building, escorted by a young soldier who wouldn't look her in the eye. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and her breath formed brief clouds in the frigid air. She wore no coat. They hadn't given her time to grab one. Inside, the heat of the room felt suffocating. The windows were sealed tight, blinds drawn. Two officers waited behind a long metal desk, not Evans. These were men Helene hadn't seen before. One wore intelligence insignia, the other a sharp suit with a thin black tie. Their expressions were unreadable. "Sit," the suited man said. She obeyed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "We're going to ask you some questions," the officer said. "Your cooperation will be noted in your record." Helene nodded once. "I've done nothing wrong." They didn't respond. Instead, the questions began, clipped and rapid. "Where were you on the night the files went missing? What time did you leave the infirmary? Who gave you access to the West Wing?" She answered each one calmly, though her voice quivered. Every answer was truthful, and still they didn't stop. The interrogation felt less about finding the truth and more about breaking her. "Your command of English is unusually strong," the man in the suit observed. "Studied in school?" "My father was a professor. He made us learn it young. Useful skill. For a spy." She blinked, the insult striking deeper than she expected. "I'm a nurse." "That's all I've ever been." The officer leaned forward. "And yet you're the only one with unsupervised access and no confirmed alibi." Helene clenched her fists. "Because I stayed late cleaning bandages. You can ask Margaret Lewis." The man's expression didn't change. "She's already vouched for you, but friendship isn't evidence." The door opened suddenly. Evans stepped in, a file in his hand. "That's enough," he said. His voice carried no room for argument. The two officers exchanged glances. "She's the most obvious link," one muttered. Evans placed the file on the desk. "And here's your actual culprit." He opened it, revealing photographs, supply logs, and a surveillance note. A janitor, a German prisoner trusted with maintenance, had been caught trying to mail a sealed envelope through the camp's laundry. Inside were troop movement details. He worked the night shift, had access to the administrative wing while cleaning, used a fake name on the intake forms, Evans said flatly. Silence filled the room. Helene sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. The man in the suit finally spoke. "You're dismissed, Nurse Krauss." Evans didn't wait. He guided her out, his hand light on her arm. When the door shut behind them, Helene exhaled sharply. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Because I didn't want to promise your name was clear until I could prove it," he said. "You deserve truth, not hope." She turned toward him, something bitter rising in her throat. "Do you know what it feels like to be treated like a traitor by people who once trusted you?" He met her gaze. "Yes, more than you think." For a long moment they stood in silence. Outside, the snow kept falling. Helene pulled her arms around herself, cold settling deep into her bones. But as they walked back to the barracks, heads turned, not in suspicion now, but in quiet respect. A few soldiers even nodded at her. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the beginning of something harder to earn, understanding. It began with silence. No gunfire, no alarms, no shouting, just a low murmur that spread like wind through the trees. By mid-morning it became official. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Helene stood in the infirmary doorway, staring out at the sunlit camp. The air was still. She expected cheering, celebration, something loud, but instead there was only quiet. Men and women, German and American, stood uncertain, as though unsure how to breathe in a world that no longer required enemies. Lotta approached, her eyes red. "It's done," she said softly. "The Reich is gone." Helene didn't answer right away. Her thoughts swirled in all directions. "My brother," she whispered. "I don't even know if he's alive." Margaret appeared behind them, carrying a stack of charts. "Command is waiting on word about repatriation. They'll send some of you home." Lotta nodded. "I want to go back. Even if it's all rubble." Helene looked down at her hands. "I don't know where home is anymore." In the days that followed, the camp shifted in tone. Uniforms loosened, barriers softened. German prisoners no longer kept to themselves. American medics joked more freely. And yet for Helene a strange weight settled over her shoulders. Guilt, confusion, and something like mourning. One morning she walked to the chapel on the edge of the camp. Inside, wooden benches sat in perfect silence. She knelt in the back pew and whispered into the air, "How do I grieve for a country I no longer understand?" Captain Evans found her there. He stood quietly before speaking. "You don't have to answer that today." She looked up. "You lost people too. Don't you hate us?" He shook his head. "I hated what the war made us, not you." They sat together for a long time, neither speaking. Helene finally said, "If I go back, I'm not sure who I'll be." Evans glanced at her, his voice low. "You don't have to go back. The Red Cross is petitioning for civilian nurses. You could stay, work in town, build something new." The idea hit her like a wave, staying not as a captive, not as a nurse in a foreign uniform, but as herself. No command, no flag, just Helene. That night, she opened her notebook and began a new letter, not to Wilhelm, but to herself. "You have survived a war without surrendering your soul. Let that be your victory." Outside, bonfires lit the hills around Pine Grove. Music played from the barracks, not patriotic marches, but soft jazz and folk songs. Celebration was happening in quiet corners, with cautious laughter and clinking cups. Helene stood at the edge of it all, watching. Margaret appeared beside her with 2 mugs of warm cider. "They'll always see your accent first," she said, "but eventually they'll see your heart too." Helene took the mug. "Do you think we'll ever forget?" Margaret shook her head. "No, but maybe we'll forgive." As the firelight danced in the distance, Helene made her decision. She would not return to ruins. She would stay, not to escape what had been, but to become something new in a place that had once felt like the enemy. And in that quiet, fragile moment, she felt the war truly end. Not on paper, not with flags, but within her. The package arrived quietly, as if it had taken a wrong turn through time. A Red Cross courier handed it to Helene one morning without ceremony. The box was small, wrapped in brown paper, smudged and creased from months of travel. Her name was printed carefully on top, in handwriting she hadn't seen since 1943. She carried it back to her room in silence. Lotta was gone, already on her way back to Germany. Margaret was on duty in the infirmary. Helene sat alone at the edge of her bed and ran her fingers over the string. She didn't want to open it. Not yet. But she did. Inside were letters. Dozens. Folded carefully, their edges worn, they smelled faintly of tobacco and ink, of Europe's fading war. She recognized Wilhelm's handwriting instantly, thin and sharp, always slanting right. Her breath caught. She unfolded the first. "Dear Helene, the snow here is thick and the cold cruel. But I remember how you used to sneak biscuits into my school bag." She smiled, tears forming. His words were simple. Stories, jokes, memories of their mother's garden, of childhood afternoons under the cherry trees. Some letters carried hints of fear, others avoided the war entirely. Then she found the final one. The date chilled her, January 12th, 1945. "They say the Russians are closing in. I don't know if I'll make it, but if I don't, please know, I never hated anyone. Not even our enemies. You taught me that, with your stubborn, infuriating kindness. If this letter reaches you, remember, you're stronger than any of us ever knew." Her chest collapsed inward. The tears came hard now, shaking her whole body. For so long, she had carried the weight of not knowing, of picturing him dying alone, forgotten. But now, in his own hand, he had reached across the distance to remind her who she was, and that he had never stopped believing in her. The knock at the door startled her. She didn't wipe her tears before opening it. Margaret saw her face and said nothing, only stepped inside and sat beside her. Helene handed her the last letter. Margaret read in silence. When she finished, she whispered, "He sounds like someone I would have liked." Helene nodded. He didn't want to be a soldier. He wanted to teach history. Margaret touched her shoulder. "Maybe that's what you're doing now, teaching people not to forget." Later that night, Helene took the letters outside. The stars were clear above the pines, the night cold, but not cruel. She sat beneath the tree where she'd once buried her own letters. With shaking hands she read them all aloud, every line, every memory, and then, one by one, she folded them carefully and placed them into the same tin box. This time, she did not bury them. She left them beneath the tree, tucked into the roots, as if offering them back to the earth. "I forgive you," she whispered, not to Wilhelm but to herself, for surviving, for doubting, for moving forward. When she stood, the wind passed through the branches like a sigh. She turned back toward the lights of the camp, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Spring arrived slowly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The snow receded, leaving behind muddy paths and soft green shoots pressing through the thawing ground. Helene no longer wore her Red Cross uniform. Her papers had been updated, her status changed. She was no longer a prisoner, nor officially part of the war effort. She was now a civilian, a resident nurse at the small county hospital in Chester, New Jersey. The town was modest, tree-lined streets, a general store with a bell over the door, a diner that smelled of coffee and cinnamon. The first time she walked through it, wearing a borrowed coat and carrying a second-hand handbag, people stared. Some politely nodded. Others didn't. At the hospital, she was introduced as Miss Krauss, a trained nurse from Europe. The word German was used sparingly. She worked under Dr. Samuel Price, a serious man with tired eyes and a good heart. His instructions were clear. His standards were high, but he never once mentioned her accent. Margaret visited when she could. They'd meet on Saturdays at the park bench near the bakery, where children chased each other through the grass and the smell of bread filled the air. "How are they treating you?" Margaret asked one afternoon. Helene sipped her tea slowly. "Some pretend I don't exist. Others pretend I'm not who I am." Margaret nodded. "It takes time. This country forgets quickly, but it forgives slowly." At the hospital, Helene poured herself into the work. She treated every patient with the same care she'd given wounded men in war. Steady hands, soft voice, sharp eyes. One elderly woman, Mrs. Donnelly, stared at her for days without speaking. Then, after Helene comforted her through a difficult night, the woman reached out and touched her hand. "You remind me of my daughter," she whispered. "She didn't come back from France." Helene smiled through the ache. "I'm sorry." Mrs. Donnelly nodded. "So am I. But thank you for staying." In the evenings, Helene walked the quiet streets alone. Sometimes she passed houses with blue stars in the windows, sometimes black ones. She never knocked, but she understood. Grief was a language without borders. She wrote to her mother in careful script, unsure if the letters would reach her. In them she described America not as a paradise, but as a place trying to heal, a place that had not forgotten the war, but had never truly lived it either. One Sunday morning, a little girl in church turned to her and said, "Are you the nurse with the funny voice?" Helene smiled. "Yes." The girl grinned. "My daddy said you fixed his foot better than Dr. Price." She laughed, an honest, open laugh she hadn't heard from herself in years. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers in wooden pews beneath the soft glow of stained glass, something shifted. She didn't feel like a foreigner. She felt possible. That night, she opened her notebook again. The same one that once held fear and sorrow now welcomed hope. "I am not rebuilding the past," she wrote. "I am building something entirely new, a life that belongs only to me." The ink dried slowly. The house was quiet. Outside, the spring wind carried the sound of a distant train, not a memory of escape, but a whisper of something still coming. The telegram arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked among medical supply invoices. Helene unfolded it with cautious hands. The message was brief. "Captain Evans reassigned to San Francisco. Leaves Friday." She stared at the words until they blurred. They had spoken less in recent months, their conversations growing shorter, more formal. Still, his presence had anchored her. Quiet, constant, reassuring. The thought of him leaving made something in her chest go still. Margaret found her sitting in the garden behind the hospital, the telegram folded neatly in her lap. "You're going to say goodbye, aren't you?" Helene looked up, uncertain. Would it matter? Margaret sat beside her. "He never stopped watching you walk into a room." "That always matters." Friday came too quickly. Helene took the early train to the base, the same route she had once travelled in fear. This time, the fields were green, the skies clear. She wore a plain navy dress and carried nothing but a small envelope in her pocket. At the transport depot, she found him loading his things into a military truck. His uniform looked heavier than before, the creases sharper. When he saw her, he paused. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure either." They stood for a moment in the gravel yard, surrounded by soldiers and silence. Finally, she said, "I wanted to thank you for believing me, for defending me." "You didn't need defending," Evans replied. "You needed someone to speak truth when others chose fear." She reached into her coat and handed him the envelope. A letter, just one this time, for the road. He took it gently. "Will I see you again?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I hope so." He smiled, the kind that carried regret and affection in equal measure. "I'll write, I promise." Helene nodded, fighting the sting behind her eyes. "You always did keep your promises." The whistle blew. He stepped back, hesitated, then said, "You changed everything, Helene. For me. For a lot of people." She didn't speak. Words felt too fragile. Instead, she raised her hand in farewell, holding it steady until the truck disappeared down the road. That evening, she returned to Chester and found the hospital quiet. In the break room, Margaret waited with 2 cups of tea and a smile that said everything. Helene sank into the chair beside her. "He's gone." Margaret nodded. "And you stayed." They sat together in comfortable silence. Then Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather journal. "I think you should teach," she said. "There's a new training program starting in the fall." "You've done more with less than anyone I know." Helene opened the journal, running her fingers over the blank pages. "Me? Teach American nurses? Why not? You already taught me." Helene looked out the window. Children rode bicycles past the fence. Somewhere a dog barked. Life continued. And within that gentle rhythm she felt something unexpected. Purpose. Not as a nurse shaped by war, but as a woman shaping peace. She smiled almost shyly. "Then let's begin." The plaque was small, bronze and slightly weathered, mounted beside a black and white photograph under glass. It showed 2 nurses, one in an American uniform, the other unmistakably German, treating a wounded soldier on a field cot. The caption read, "Compassion Beyond Borders, Pine Grove, 1945. Helene stood in front of it with her hands folded quietly in front of her. The museum was modern, bright, filled with artifacts from World War II, helmets, ration books, love letters, and uniforms behind glass. Visitors moved around her, reading, pointing, whispering. No one recognized her. She was older now. Her auburn hair turned silver, her frame thinner, slower. But her eyes still held the sharp clarity of a woman who had seen too much and chosen to remember anyway. A young man beside her leaned closer to the photograph. "That's wild," he said to his friend. "A German nurse working with Americans? Didn't think that ever happened." His friend shrugged. "Guess it wasn't all black and white." Helene smiled faintly. The irony never left her. History had a way of flattening what was once messy, terrifying, human. In this quiet room, she wasn't a person anymore, just part of a display. But she didn't mind. The truth was still there, tucked in the photograph, held in her stillness. A woman in a museum staff vest approached politely. "Ma'am, do you need help finding anything?" Helene looked at her name tag. Rachel. She shook her head gently. "No, I was just remembering." Rachel studied her face for a moment. "You look familiar." "I've aged out of recognition," Helene replied, a hint of humor in her voice. Rachel tilted her head. Are you the woman in that photo?" Helene paused, then nodded once. "Yes." Rachel's eyes widened. "That photo's in our school textbooks. They say it symbolizes reconciliation." Helene looked at the image again. It was survival mostly. Reconciliation came later. Rachel hesitated. Would you be willing to speak to our student group next week? Just a few words?" Helene considered it. The idea made her stomach tighten. But then she thought of Wilhelm's letters, of Margaret's laughter, of Captain Evans's quiet voice in the snow. "Yes," she said. "I think I would." She wandered the rest of the museum slowly, pausing by exhibits, with names she remembered, faces she had forgotten. In a corner display, a preserved Red Cross nurse's uniform, American style, hung behind glass, the same kind Margaret had worn. Beneath it, a small quote, "You heal people, Helene. Politics can wait outside." Helene touched the glass. Her reflection shimmered faintly over the fabric. "You'd hate this," she whispered, "but you'd be proud too." She stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. The leaves had begun to fall, dancing across the path like memory itself, fragile, unsteady, beautiful. Across the street, children ran through the park. A dog barked, someone laughed. She sat on a nearby bench and opened her notebook, still the same one, now soft with age. On the first page, she wrote a new line. "We are remembered not for whom we fought, but for whom we chose to care for." And as the sun dipped lower behind the trees, Helene closed her eyes. For a moment, time folded in on itself, and all she felt was warmth. Helene stood in her modest living room, where soft light spilled through the curtains and dust floated like old memories. On the wall, above a wooden desk, hung two photographs side by side. One was of Wilhelm in uniform, his boyish grin captured before the weight of war had bent his shoulders. The other was of Margaret, smiling in her Red Cross cap, her arms folded confidently in front of her. Beneath them, pinned to the wall, was a small card with faded ink. "You reminded me that kindness doesn't wear a uniform." Helene touched the edge of Wilhelm's frame, then Margaret's. So different, so distant, yet bound together now in memory. That afternoon she was scheduled to speak at the museum. She'd written no speech, she would simply tell the truth. The auditorium was quiet as she stepped onto the stage. Young faces watched her, curious and attentive. She gripped the podium and took a breath. "I was born in Germany. I trained as a nurse before the world tore itself apart. During the war, I treated soldiers on both sides, some who cursed me, some who wept, some who thanked me. I was called a traitor by my countrymen and a threat by my captors. I was feared, accused, defended, and eventually welcomed." She paused, letting the silence hold her words. "I was sent here, to America, expecting hatred. Instead, I was given a second chance. Not easily, not instantly, but slowly, through quiet acts of mercy." She scanned the room. "You may wonder how that happens, how enemies can become neighbors. It begins not with surrender, not with peace treaties, but with one person choosing to see another as human." A student in the front row raised her hand timidly. "Did you ever regret staying here?" Helene smiled gently. "Never. Because here I was allowed to become more than what my passport said. I was allowed to be who I truly was. A nurse, a sister, a teacher, someone who didn't want to win a war, but end one." After the talk, visitors lingered, shaking her hand, asking for photos. She answered each question patiently, kindly. A few people brought her letters to sign. One young woman handed her a small envelope with trembling fingers. "My grandmother told me about you," she said. "She said you saved lives when no one else would." Helene held her gaze. "We all saved someone, I think. sometimes by dressing wounds, sometimes just by listening. That evening, back at home, she sat in her favorite chair and watched the sky darken through the window. A faint breeze stirred the curtains. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted in, a dog barking, children laughing, a car pulling into a driveway. She opened her notebook one last time. We feared the wrong things, not the enemy, but the emptiness we allowed between us. Kindness was never weakness. It was always the strength we didn't know we needed. She closed the notebook. Then, with steady hands, she reached for the lamp and turned off the light. If this story moved you, subscribe and explore more true stories that reveal the humanity behind history. And if you want to continue learning about the people who found hope in the ruins of war, click the next video on your screen. Their stories deserve to be remembered.